He
It
looked me
takes
dead in the
courage to
eye,
face these
his
moments,
tailored suit
but I
perfectly
promise you,
dry
when you
despite the
lean into
pouring
that
rain, and
vulnerability,
made an
you
offer
find
that
strength
sounded
you
like it
never
came
knew you
straight from
had.
a movie. He said he had $500 million. Just say yes, and tomorrow we will sign the papers at the courthouse and destroy them both. I never imagined discovering my husband's twisted double life would bring a billionaire to my doorstep with a proposition of pure revenge. My name is Olivia. I am 33 years old, and I spent the better part of a decade believing I was building a secure life with the man of my dreams. I was completely wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever survived a devastating betrayal by someone you loved and fought your way back to the top. The nightmare began on a gloomy Tuesday evening in Seattle. The rain was coming down in freezing sheets, soaking right through my thin trench coat as I stood under the flickering light of a convenience store ATM. I had just finished another grueling 10-hour shift working from home and needed to grab groceries for dinner. I slid my debit card into the machine, punched in my PIN, and requested $40. The screen processed for a moment before flashing a bright red error message. Transaction declined. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. I assumed it was just a glitch with the old machine. I pulled out my phone, shielding the screen from the rain, and logged into my mobile banking app. I expected to see our joint savings account sitting comfortably at $150,000. That was the nest egg we had been aggressively building for 7 long years. Instead, the screen loaded, and my heart physically dropped into my stomach. The bold black numbers stared back at me. $0.00. My breath caught in my throat. I refreshed the app. Once. Twice. The number did not change. $150,000 was completely gone. The money had just vanished. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled back to my 5-year-old sedan, dropping my keys twice before unlocking the doors. To understand the magnitude of that missing money, you have to understand exactly how it was earned. For 7 years, I worked my fingers to the bone as a remote data analyst. I routinely put in 60-hour work weeks, staring at complex spreadsheets until my vision blurred and my back ached. I lived incredibly frugally. I skipped girls' trips, declined dinner invitations, and bought my clothes on clearance racks. I brewed my own coffee every single morning to save an extra $5 a day. Every extra dollar I earned went straight into that joint savings account. I did it all willingly because I believed in our shared vision. My husband, Greg, was 35 years old and working as a real estate sales director. He constantly told me that in his competitive line of work, perception was reality. He claimed he needed to project wealth to earn wealth. So while I brown-bagged my lunches, our money funded his lavish lifestyle. He leased a brand new luxury sedan every 2 years because he said he could not put high-value clients in an older vehicle. He bought custom-tailored suits, expensive watches, and insisted on hosting high-end client dinners. He smelled of expensive cologne, while I smelled like cheap coffee and exhaustion. I justified his excessive spending because I loved him blindly. I sacrificed my own comfort so we could secure a down payment for our forever home and build a safety net for the children we were planning to have next year. That $150,000 represented my lost youth and my unwavering loyalty. Sitting in the damp, freezing interior of my car, my hands shook violently as I dialed our bank's customer service number. The automated voice prompts felt like torture as I frantically mashed the keypad to reach a human being. The windows of my car began to fog up from my panicked breathing. Finally, a representative answered. I practically yelled my account details into the receiver, begging her to tell me there was a system error, a temporary hold, a fraud alert, anything to logically explain the zero balance. She placed me on a brief hold. Those 2 minutes were the longest of my entire life. I stared through the rain-slicked windshield, my mind racing through terrifying scenarios. Had our identities been compromised? When the representative returned to the line, her tone had shifted to that practiced, overly calm voice professionals use when delivering terrible news. She informed me that there was absolutely no system error. She said the funds had been transferred out of the account just 3 hours earlier. I asked her where the money went, demanding to know what thief had authorized the transaction. The answer she gave me felt like a physical punch to the chest. The representative stated that my husband, Greg, had personally authorized the wire transfer. He had walked into a local branch, provided his government identification, and wired the entire $150,000 to an offshore limited liability company. Since it was a joint account, he had full legal authority to drain every single penny without my consent or knowledge. I could not breathe. The man I had sacrificed everything for had just wiped out my entire life savings. He had meticulously planned this, moving our secure future to an untraceable offshore account while I was sitting at my desk working. I thanked the teller mechanically and ended the call. I was sitting in a freezing car with exactly $12 in my wallet, $0 in the bank, and a husband who had orchestrated the ultimate financial betrayal. Little did I know, the missing money was only the beginning of the nightmare he had prepared for me. Section 2000 words. I drove back to our house like a woman possessed. The tires of my old sedan spun against the wet pavement as I took corners entirely too fast. My vision blurred by both the relentless Seattle downpour and the tears of sheer panic stinging my eyes. The entire drive felt like a fever dream. I kept waiting to wake up. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Greg would have an answer. Maybe he moved the funds to a high-yield account. Maybe he was surprising me with an investment property. My rational brain, the part of me that analyzed data for a living, desperately tried to construct a scenario where my husband was not a monster. I slammed the brakes in our driveway, parked at a crooked angle, and sprinted up the walkway. I shoved my key into the lock, twisting it with so much force it nearly snapped. I burst through the front door, my wet trench coat dripping onto the hardwood floor of the foyer. Greg. I screamed his name, my voice echoing off the high ceilings we had painted together just last summer. I found him in the master bedroom, but he was not panicking. He was not remorseful. He was casually zipping up a brand new Louis Vuitton suitcase. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, a silver watch gleaming on his wrist, and not a single hair out of place. When he looked up at me standing there drenched and trembling, there was absolutely no guilt on his face. Instead, a smug, arrogant smirk spread across his lips. "Where is it?" I demanded, my chest heaving, as I marched toward him. "Where is the $150,000 from our joint account?" Greg let out a short, dismissive laugh. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He calmly picked up his suitcase, walked past me into the hallway, and headed straight for the kitchen. I followed closely behind him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I asked you a question, Greg," I yelled, my voice cracking. "The bank said you wired our entire life savings offshore. Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not just steal our future." He stopped at the kitchen island, set his suitcase on the floor, and turned to face me. He leaned against the cool marble countertop, crossing his arms over his chest. "It is not a mistake, Olivia." He said it with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "I took the money. I earned it by putting up with this miserable, suffocating life for the past 7 years. Consider it my exit bonus." I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing as I struggled to process the sheer cruelty of his words. "Exit bonus," I choked out. "I earned that money. I worked 60 hours a week while you bought designer clothes and leased sports cars. We were supposed to be saving for a family." Greg rolled his eyes and reached into his leather briefcase resting on the counter. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stapled together and tossed them onto the kitchen island. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the marble sent a shockwave straight through my spine. "You really think this is just about the savings account?" he asked, tilting his head with a mockingly sympathetic look. "Read it, Olivia. You are the data analyst. Analyze the data." My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the documents. The bold black letters at the top of the first page read, "Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement." My eyes frantically scanned the paperwork. It was a loan taken out against our house, the home I had saved for years to purchase. The loan amount listed was $200,000. The funds had been disbursed earlier that morning into the same offshore account where our savings went. I felt the blood drain from my face. The room started to spin. "You took out a HELOC," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The deed is in my name. The mortgage is in my name. You cannot do this without my signature." I flipped to the signature page. Right there on the bottom line was my name. It was an electronic signature stamped and dated with an IP address and a digital certificate. "I handled the paperwork for you," Greg said smoothly, picking an invisible piece of lint off his suit jacket. Electronic signatures are so convenient these days. It was incredibly easy to intercept the verification emails while you were busy staring at your spreadsheets in the home office. You never even noticed I had your laptop. I authorized the loan, approved the wire transfer, and emptied the equity. The reality hit me with the force of a freight train. He had not just stolen the $150,000 in cash. He had actively forged my digital signature to borrow $200,000 against my house. He was walking away with $350,000 of stolen capital, leaving me with an entirely depleted bank account and a massive unpayable debt tied directly to my name. If I did not pay it, I would lose the house. I would be bankrupt. "How could you do this to me?" I sobbed, the betrayal cutting so deep I felt physically sick. "I gave you everything. I supported you." Greg scoffed, his face twisting into a sneer of pure disdain. "You gave me boredom, Olivia. You gave me a small, pathetic life. You sit at a desk in sweatpants all day analyzing numbers for a living. You are predictable. You lack vision. I am a real estate director. I need to be surrounded by luxury. I need to be around people who understand wealth and status." He stepped closer, towering over me, his cologne suddenly suffocating. "I found someone who actually matches my ambition. Someone who knows how to live, not just exist on a budget. You were a stepping stone, Olivia. A reliable, boring safety net, while I figured out my next move. Well, I figured it out. I am taking what I need to build the life I actually deserve." I stood frozen, completely paralyzed by the realization that the man I had married was a complete illusion. Every kiss, every "I love you," every plan for the future had been a calculated performance while he systematically drained my resources. He looked at me not with love or even regret, but with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had just finished consuming its prey. He had saddled me with crippling debt, destroyed my financial foundation, and now he was leaving to spend my stolen money with another woman. And that was when his cell phone rang, breaking the heavy silence in the kitchen. Greg glanced at the glowing screen of his smartphone. A photo of a stunning, sharply contoured blonde woman flashed, accompanied by the name Naomi. Instead of silencing the device or stepping into another room, he maintained direct eye contact with me, tapped the green accept button, and deliberately placed the phone on speaker mode. He set it down on the marble island, right next to the fraudulent loan documents. "Greg, darling," a woman's voice chimed through the speaker. Her tone was light, airy, and dripped with an unmistakable, sickening condescension. "Tell me the boring wife has finally moved out. The interior designers want to do the initial walkthrough tomorrow morning, and I simply cannot deal with her cheap furniture being in the way when they measure for the new dining set." I stopped breathing. My eyes darted from the phone to Greg. He smirked, leaning casually over the counter with his arms crossed. "I am handling the eviction as we speak, babe," Greg replied, his voice oozing a disgusting level of affection I had not heard directed at me in years. "She is standing right here processing the bad news." A sharp, glittering laugh erupted from the speaker. "Oh, how tragic for her. Just make sure she takes her discount clothing with her. I do not want any of her depressing energy left in our space. Call me when the locks are changed." The line clicked dead. The silence returned heavier and infinitely more toxic than before. Greg picked up his phone, slipped it into his tailored suit pocket, and finally dropped the last remaining shred of the man I thought I married. "You heard her, Olivia," he said, his tone entirely devoid of empathy. "It is time for you to pack a bag and get out." I gripped the edge of the kitchen island to keep my knees from buckling. "Get out. This is my house. My name is on the deed." Greg let out a harsh, patronizing sigh, as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "Did you not pay attention to the financial reality I just laid out for you? You have absolutely no money. I stopped paying the mortgage 3 months ago, and I am certainly not paying a dime toward the new line of credit I just took out. The bank will be initiating formal foreclosure proceedings very soon. You cannot afford to keep the lights on, let alone fight a foreclosure." He stepped away from the counter, adjusting his cuffs with sickening precision before grabbing the handle of his expensive designer suitcase. I have already arranged for a locksmith to arrive in 20 minutes. He is changing the front, back, and garage locks. You can either walk out of here with your dignity, or you can stay and explain to the local police why you are trespassing on a property that is about to be seized by the bank. I really do not care either way. I was banking on my emotional collapse. He wanted me to fall to my knees, to scream, to beg him to stay. He thrived on feeling superior. I saw it in the way his chest puffed out, waiting for the hysterical breakdown of the weak, predictable woman he thought I was. I completely refused to give him the twisted satisfaction he was so desperately craving. A strange glacial calm suddenly washed over my burning panic. My mind, trained to process data and compartmentalize chaotic variables, abruptly snapped into survival mode. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. 20 minutes, I stated coldly. I turned on my heel and walked up the staircase, my wet shoes squeaking slightly against the hardwood. I could feel his bewildered gaze burning into my back. Entering the master bedroom, I grabbed a sturdy canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. I moved with robotic efficiency. I threw in a week's worth of practical clothing, my backup running shoes, essential toiletries, and my most important asset, my work laptop. As long as I had my laptop, I could still access my remote job and secure my remaining stream of income. I grabbed my passport, my birth certificate, and the small box containing my grandmother's vintage watch. I left behind the wedding dress hanging in the corner. I left behind the framed anniversary photos. I left behind every single physical reminder of the parasitic liar standing downstairs. Zipping the duffel bag closed, I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder and marched back down the stairs. Greg was waiting by the front door, looking slightly unsettled by my absolute silence. No parting words, he mocked, though his voice lacked its previous confident bite. I walked right past him, pulling the front door open. The freezing Seattle rain immediately lashed against my face. "I am going to destroy you, Greg," I said without yelling, delivering the words as a simple, undeniable fact. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me, not waiting to see his reaction. The rain battered my windshield as I drove aimlessly for the first few miles, my tires fighting for traction on the flooded streets. The heater in my old sedan struggled to combat the damp, biting chill seeping into my bones. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My bank account was empty. My credit was about to be obliterated by a fraudulent loan. My husband had discarded me for a woman named Naomi, who wanted to redecorate the house I paid for. I needed a sanctuary. I needed an ally. I turned the car toward the eastern suburbs, navigating the slick, winding roads, toward the only safe place I knew remained in this city. My younger sister Rebecca and her husband DeAndre. DeAndre was a fiercely intelligent, fiercely protective African-American man who worked as a high-level forensic accountant. If anyone could help me trace the stolen funds and untangle the financial sabotage Greg had orchestrated, it was him. Rebecca and DeAndre had always been my grounding force, a beacon of stability in my otherwise chaotic life. I just needed to reach their front door. I turned onto their quiet, tree-lined street, the familiar glow of their porch light, cutting through the heavy rain. I let out a shaky breath of relief, preparing to pull into their driveway, but I had to slam on my brakes. Sitting idling by the curb, completely blocking the entrance to Rebecca and DeAndre's driveway, was a massive, sleek black Rolls-Royce. The vehicle's heavily tinted windows completely obscured anyone inside, making it impossible to see who was watching me. It looked entirely out of place in this quiet suburban neighborhood, like a shark resting in a swimming pool. I put my car in park, my heart rate accelerating as the rear door of the luxury vehicle slowly began to open. Stepping into the freezing rain, my exhaustion transformed into defensive rage. I marched toward the Rolls-Royce, prepared to scream at whoever was blocking my sanctuary. I had just been thrown out of my own house, my savings decimated, and my future completely stolen. I was in absolutely no mood to deal with an arrogant driver obstructing the only safe place I had left in this city. A tall man stepped from the back seat with effortless, predatory grace, wearing a tailored charcoal suit untouched by the rain. A driver materialized holding a massive black umbrella, casting the stranger's features into sharp relief. He appeared to be in his early 40s with touches of silver at his temples and eyes the exact color of slate. He looked like he owned the very street we stood on, his entire presence demanding immediate compliance. I stopped in my tracks, clutching my duffel bag tighter against my chest as the freezing water soaked through my thin coat. "Olivia," he said. His voice was low and resonant, cutting through the rain with absolute authority. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" He simply studied me with those piercing slate eyes. "I know a great deal about you, Olivia. I know you work as a remote data analyst. I know your husband Greg just walked out. And I know exactly what he took." The panic I fought hard to suppress clawed its way back. "Listen to me," I warned, my voice shaking. "I do not know what kind of sick game Greg put you up to, but move your car right now." The stranger remained still. "Greg lacks the intelligence to comprehend who I am. I am here because of the $150,000 that vanished from your savings account this afternoon. I am also here because of the $200,000 home equity line of credit executed against your property." The ground beneath my feet collapsed. How could a stranger possibly have access to my financial disaster? The transfer happened mere hours ago. I had not even told my sister yet. Before I could demand answers, the front door of Rebecca's house slammed open. My brother-in-law, DeAndre, rushed out holding a large golf umbrella, his face etched with deep concern. "Olivia," DeAndre called out, jogging down the driveway. "What is going on?" He reached my side, lifting the umbrella over my head, but his protective momentum came to a sudden halt. His eyes landed on the tall man beside the Rolls-Royce. My brother-in-law, a brilliant forensic accountant who analyzed corporate fraud for the top financial firms in the state, physically froze. "Mr. Wright," DeAndre said, his voice replaced by a tone of absolute professional shock. The stranger shifted his gaze, his expression remaining perfectly stoic. "DeAndre, I recall your work on the Sterling merger. Your auditing was exceptionally precise." I looked frantically between the two men, completely lost. "DeAndre, you know him." DeAndre swallowed hard, deliberately positioning himself between the stranger and me. "Olivia, this is Harrison Wright. He is a senior partner at one of the largest venture capital firms on the West Coast. He dismantles international companies for a living, leaving executives with nothing. What is a man like him doing parked outside my house?" Harrison ignored DeAndre's defensive posture and returned his intense gaze to me. There was zero pity in his expression. I felt like a victim crushed under Greg's betrayal, but Harrison looked at me like a business acquisition waiting to be weaponized. "I am not here to offer you sympathy, Olivia," Harrison stated, his voice cutting through the Seattle storm. "I am here to offer answers. I know exactly where your stolen money went. I know the name of the offshore shell company. I know the woman he is currently with, and I know exactly what they plan to do with your $350,000. I stood paralyzed. The freezing rain soaked my jeans, but I barely felt the cold. This billionaire titan, a man who dismantled corporations for sport, was telling me he held the blueprint to my ruined life. "Why?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "Why do you care about my stolen money? What does this have to do with you?" Harrison took a slow, deliberate step forward, unbothered by the rain hitting his shoulders. "Because the woman your husband is currently entertaining is a parasite. Unfortunately for both of them, they made a catastrophic error in judgment when they initiated this scheme." He gestured toward the end of the street. "There is a 24-hour diner 3 blocks from here. Give me 15 minutes. I will show you the exact financial paper trail they used to ruin you. More importantly, I will show you exactly how we will take everything back and leave them with nothing." DeAndre grabbed my arm. "Olivia, do not do this. You are exhausted and vulnerable. Men like Harrison Wright make transactions, not favors. We can go inside, pull your credit reports, and file a police report right now. Let me handle the forensic tracking." I looked at my brother-in-law. His protective instincts were beautiful, but I knew the harsh reality of the legal system. A standard police report regarding a joint bank account would be immediately labeled a civil dispute by the local authorities. Greg would tie me up in divorce court for years, dragging out the proceedings while he drained my assets dry and lived lavishly on my hard-earned money. I needed something far more devastating than a civil lawsuit. I needed absolute, scorched earth retaliation. I needed the kind of legal and financial power that could trap Greg in the corner he thought he backed me into. I tightened my grip on my duffel bag and turned back to Harrison Wright. His slate eyes were locked onto mine, waiting for my calculation to conclude. He was offering a weapon, and right now I needed a weapon far more than I needed shelter warmth or a shoulder to cry on. 15 minutes, I said, my voice hardening into a tone I hardly recognized. DeAndre is coming with me. We will meet you at the diner. Harrison gave a single sharp nod of approval. He turned and slid back into the pristine interior of the Rolls-Royce. The heavy door shut with a solid, echoing thud, sealing him inside, and the luxury vehicle silently glided away into the dark street, leaving us standing in the downpour. I looked at DeAndre, my resolve hardening. We had a meeting to attend, and I was going to get my money back. Section 5. 1,000 words. We drove the short distance to the 24-hour diner in heavy silence. The flickering neon sign of the establishment buzzed weakly through the relentless rain, casting a sickly red glow over the wet asphalt. DeAndre and I walked inside, shivering in our damp coats, instantly contrasting with Harrison Wright. The billionaire sat waiting in a secluded corner booth, looking entirely undisturbed by the late hour or the grimy surroundings. A single cup of black coffee sat untouched on the sticky laminate table in front of him. As we slid into the cracked vinyl booth opposite him, Harrison did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He reached onto the seat beside him, produced a thick black dossier, and slid it smoothly across the table. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening the heavy folder. The very first page featured a high-resolution photograph of a woman. It was the same stunning, sharply contoured blonde I had briefly seen flashing on Greg's phone screen just an hour ago. Naomi. She was dripping in diamonds, wearing a designer evening gown, and standing next to Harrison at some exclusive charity gala. I looked up at the billionaire sitting across from me, my mind struggling to bridge the enormous gap between his world and mine. That is Naomi, Harrison stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. She is my wife. We were married 2 years ago. I knew she was drawn to my financial status, which I accepted at the time, but I expected basic loyalty. Instead, she has been sleeping with your husband for the past 6 months. I felt my stomach churn violently. My husband, a mid-level real estate director who obsessed over projecting false wealth, was having a secret affair with the wife of a Seattle billionaire. How did Greg even meet her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sold a piece of commercial property to one of my holding companies last year, Harrison replied smoothly. Naomi attended the closing meeting with me. They apparently struck up a conversation while I was busy reviewing contracts. But we are not here to discuss their illicit romance, Olivia. We are here to discuss the financial infrastructure of their betrayal. Harrison reached over and flipped to the next section of the dossier. The pages were dense with banking records, wire transfer logs, and state business registrations. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger to a highlighted line showing a corporate entity named Nova Horizons Group. Naomi wants to leave me, Harrison explained, steepling his fingers together. However, she knows that initiating a divorce means walking away with absolutely nothing due to our legal agreements. She needed an escape fund, a highly lucrative asset completely hidden from my auditors. She convinced your husband to build it for her. Build what? DeAndre interjected, leaning forward to inspect the official documents. A high-end, outrageously luxurious restaurant in the heart of downtown Seattle, Harrison answered. They are using the Nova Horizons Group as a shell company to sign the commercial lease and hire elite contractors. But launching a luxury restaurant requires massive upfront capital. Naomi cannot touch my accounts without setting off immediate alarms. Greg certainly did not have the cash either, so they decided to take yours. I stared at the financial records, the crushing reality of their scheme paralyzing my lungs. The $150,000 from our joint savings. I breathed out, tracing the numbers on the page. And the $200,000 from the home equity line of credit. Exactly, Harrison confirmed. $350,000 in stolen capital to seed their shell company. They plan to open the doors, establish a massive cash flow, and run away together on your dime. DeAndre pulled the thick folder closer, his professional instincts kicking into overdrive. As a forensic accountant, he lived for tracing hidden assets and exposing corporate deception. His eyes darted rapidly across the printed spreadsheets, routing numbers, and digital timestamps. I watched his jaw clench tight as he traced the path of my stolen money. "This is unbelievable," DeAndre muttered, shaking his head in sheer disgust. "Greg is an absolute amateur. He thinks because he routed the wire transfer through a secondary offshore LLC that the money is untraceable. But he left it a digital footprint the size of a crater. Look at this data." DeAndre pointed to a column of IP addresses. He authorized the wire transfer and the home equity loan using his own personal mobile device. He did not even bother to use a secure network or a virtual private network. "I can map this entire transaction back to a public coffee shop 2 blocks from his real estate office. And here," DeAndre flipped another page, his voice rising with fierce indignation. "He used Olivia's forged electronic signature for the loan, but the confirmation email was sent to an encrypted server that Naomi registered using her personal credit card. They literally cross-contaminated their own fraud." Harrison gave a sharp, validating nod. "Your brother-in-law is exceptionally sharp, Olivia. He sees exactly what my private investigators saw. Your husband and my wife are blinded by their own arrogance. They believe they are untouchable, but they have committed blatant wire fraud." The magnitude of this situation hung heavily in the diner booth. I had the answers now. I knew exactly where my money was and what Greg planned to do with it. But one glaring question remained. I looked straight into Harrison Wright's slate-colored eyes, refusing to be intimidated by his power. "You are a billionaire," I stated flatly. $350,000 is literally pocket change to you. You could crush Naomi in divorce court tomorrow based on the infidelity alone. Why are you sitting in a rundown diner at midnight tracking down a stolen home equity loan with a remote data analyst?" Harrison leaned back against the vinyl seat. The dim neon light cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look dangerously ruthless. When he spoke, the temperature in the booth seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "You are right, Olivia. The money means absolutely nothing to me. But punishing betrayal means everything." Naomi looked me in the eye and swore loyalty, while secretly plotting to build an empire with another man using stolen funds. "If I simply divorce her, she will play the victim to the media and try to salvage her social standing." His slate eyes narrowed, glinting with a cold, calculating light. "I do not want to just divorce her. I want to utterly dismantle the escape plan she thought she so cleverly built. I want her to realize that she tried to outsmart me, only to find herself trapped with a man who is about to be federally indicted for fraud. I want her to walk away from my life with absolutely nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his vengeance settle over the table. "You want your money and your dignity back. I want absolute retribution. We have a common enemy, Olivia, and a shared goal. That makes us the absolute perfect partners for exactly what comes next. Our retaliation starts tomorrow morning." I looked at DeAndre, seeking his reassurance, and he nodded firmly. Section 6, 1,000 words. I turned my attention back to the billionaire sitting across the cracked vinyl table. The rain continued to batter the diner windows, but the storm outside felt trivial compared to the financial hurricane Harrison Wright was casually dissecting. He folded his hands together, his slate eyes gleaming with a terrifying level of strategic calculation. "Naomi is greedy, but she is not entirely stupid," Harrison explained, his voice low and deliberate. "Before we walked down the aisle, I required her to sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement. My legal team spent months drafting a contract with absolutely zero loopholes. The stipulations are brutally clear. If Naomi initiates a divorce, she walks away with nothing. No alimony, no real estate, no spousal support. Furthermore, if she is caught establishing secret assets with stolen funds, or if she commits infidelity, a severe penalty clause activates. She forfeits any standard marital payouts and faces massive financial damages." I listened intently, my analytical mind snapping the pieces of the puzzle together. "So she knew she could not take your money," I said, leaning forward against the table. "She realized she was legally trapped. If she just left you, she would be completely broke and locked out of the elite social circles she desperately craves. She needed a golden parachute that your auditors could not trace back to your accounts." "Precisely. Harrison confirmed, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. Naomi likes the luxury lifestyle, but she hates being controlled by the rules that come with it. She wanted out of our marriage, but she absolutely refused to leave empty-handed. She needed a secret safety net. She needed liquid capital to secure a high-end commercial lease and build a legitimate cash flow operation before handing me the divorce papers. That is exactly where your husband came in. Greg is arrogant, desperately insecure about his status, and incredibly easy to manipulate. Naomi seduced him, played into his ridiculous fantasy of being a high-rolling restaurant owner, and convinced him to fund their escape. DeAndre crossed his arms, his forensic accountant brain running the numbers at lightning speed. But Greg did not have the cash. He had to steal it from Olivia. Naomi essentially used Greg to rob your sister-in-law, completely bypassing your financial security systems, Harrison. It is actually a devious workaround. She used him as a blunt instrument. Harrison agreed, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy for Greg. She stroked his ego until he felt bold enough to commit wire fraud against his own wife. Now they have your $350,000 sitting in a shell company waiting to fund their grand opening. They think they have successfully outsmarted a billionaire and discarded a data analyst without facing a single consequence. Harrison leaned closer, invading my personal space, with an overwhelming aura of pure, concentrated power. The ambient noise of the diner, the clatter of plates, and the hum of the refrigerator seemed to completely fade away. He did not look at me with pity or sorrow. He looked at me like a five-star general assessing a key ally on the battlefield. I do not do things halfway, Olivia. If I simply file for divorce, my lawyers will certainly crush Naomi, but she will drag the proceedings out in civil court for years, playing the victim. Greg might even manage to hide your stolen funds in the restaurant's operational costs before a judge can officially freeze his assets. I want them destroyed immediately, publicly, and completely. To do that, I need to shift this from a standard divorce dispute into a massive corporate retaliation. And to do that, I need you. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of his vengeance. What exactly are you suggesting we do? Harrison looked me dead in the eye and dropped the ultimate hook. I have $500 million. I have the best legal team in the country. Partner with me. Marry me on paper. It gives my lawyers the legal standing to aggressively pursue Greg's assets as marital damages for my new wife. Say yes and we destroy them. The words hung in the humid air, heavy and loaded with unimaginable consequences. Marry a billionaire. A man I had met less than an hour ago. A man who dismantled companies and crushed his enemies for sport. It sounded like pure madness. It sounded like the plot of a ridiculous daytime thriller. But I was not a woman prone to emotional hysterics or impulsive meltdowns. I was a highly trained, deeply rational data analyst. My entire career was built on evaluating complex variables, mitigating risks, and projecting future outcomes with absolute precision. I forced my mind to compartmentalize the shock and run the numbers objectively. Variable A was my current horrifying reality. I was virtually homeless. My joint savings account was completely wiped out. I was saddled with a fraudulent $200,000 home equity line of credit. The mortgage was in default. If I tried to fight Greg alone, I would have to hire a cheap divorce attorney I could barely afford. We would spend years locked in a bitter, drawn-out civil court battle. Greg would eagerly use my own stolen money to fund his aggressive legal defense. He would drag out the discovery process, force me into absolute bankruptcy, and ultimately walk away to live a life of luxury with Naomi. I would be left paying off a mountain of debt while my credit score burned to ashes. Variable B was Harrison Wright's proposal. If I agreed to this tactical alliance, the power dynamic instantly inverted. I would immediately gain access to a relentless world-class legal machine. Harrison's corporate attorneys would not play defense, they would play vicious offense. They could bypass the sluggish family court system and attack Greg using brutal corporate litigation tactics. They could freeze the shell company accounts. They could subpoena the private equity loans. They could choke the financial life out of Greg and Naomi before they even had a chance to open their restaurant doors. The humiliation of being discarded for another woman still burned a hole in my chest. The memory of Greg smirking in our kitchen telling me I was boring and predictable fueled a dark burning fire in my veins. He thought I was weak. He thought I would quietly accept my ruin, cry myself to sleep, and fade into obscurity without putting up a real fight. I turned my head and looked at DeAndre. As a man who spent his entire professional life unraveling complex financial crimes, he saw the absolute genius of Harrison's strategy. This was not a romance. It was a hostile corporate takeover of my ex-husband's life. DeAndre held my gaze, his dark eyes shining with fierce protective approval. He gave me a slow, definitive nod, silently confirming that the financial mechanics of Harrison's plan were not just brilliant, they were absolutely flawless. I turned back to Harrison Wright. His slate eyes were perfectly still, waiting for my final calculation to conclude. I squared my shoulders completely, ignoring my damp clothes and my shattered past. I was ready to become the architect of their downfall. I accept your proposal, I said, my voice steady, resonant, and ice cold. Let us get married. Section 7, 1000 words. I woke up the next morning on the gray sofa in Rebecca's living room. My muscles ached from the sheer adrenaline dump of the previous night. The storm outside had reduced to a steady, oppressive drizzle. But the real storm was glowing on the screen of my cell phone resting on the coffee table. A notification illuminated the dark room. A text message from Greg. I swiped the screen open, my heart rate steadying into a cold rhythm as I read his words. Hope you found a comfortable shelter. The bank sent the first default notice today. Good luck, loser. He was so incredibly predictable. Greg thrived on kicking people when they were down. He genuinely believed a cruel message would break whatever resolve I had left. He expected me to reply with frantic pleas, begging him to save our home. I stared at the harsh words on the screen and I felt absolutely nothing. Any trace of grief or hesitation I harbored about Harrison Wright's extreme proposal completely evaporated. Greg's text was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. He had just handed me the absolute certainty I needed to execute his financial destruction. I did not reply. I deleted the message thread, blocked his number, and stood up from the couch. It was time to go to war. Rebecca walked into the living room holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She took one look at my face and immediately understood the shift in my demeanor. My sister knew me better than anyone else. She knew I had spent 7 years shrinking myself to fit into Greg's fragile ego. That version of Olivia was dead. I walked into the guest bathroom, washed the exhaustion from my face, and pulled out the single outfit I had packed with strict intention. It was a sharp, immaculately tailored charcoal power suit. I had bought it years ago for a major corporate presentation, but Greg had told me it looked too aggressive. Today, aggressive was exactly the aesthetic I required. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style, applying minimal makeup to highlight the sharp angles of my face. I looked like a woman walking into a boardroom to execute a hostile takeover. DeAndre was waiting in the kitchen, already reviewing preliminary financial traces on his encrypted laptop. He handed me a secure flash drive containing his initial findings on Greg's wire transfers. I slipped the drive into my leather briefcase, thanking him with a firm nod. I walked out of their house and drove straight to the downtown Seattle courthouse. The towering concrete and glass architecture felt appropriate for what was about to transpire. This was not a venue for romance. It was a theater of law, and I was about to sign the most lucrative contract of my entire life. Harrison Wright was already waiting by the towering bronze doors of the courthouse entrance. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit, exuding an aura of absolute control that parted the crowded sea of pedestrians around him. 2 enormous security personnel flanked him, maintaining a discreet but undeniable perimeter. When Harrison saw me approaching in my charcoal suit, a flicker of genuine respect crossed his slate gray eyes. He did not offer a bouquet of flowers or a soft romantic smile. He offered a firm professional handshake. We bypassed the crowded public lines and were immediately escorted into a private judge's chamber. Harrison's legal team had already expedited the paperwork, bypassing standard waiting periods through their extensive connections. The judge, an older man with a weary expression, pushed a heavy stack of documents across his polished oak desk. The entire process was cold, wildly efficient, and entirely tactical. There was no mention of love, no exchange of sentimental vows, and absolutely no pretense of a fairy tale romance. We stood side by side in the sterile wood-paneled room and signed our names on the dotted lines. The scratching of our expensive pens against the heavy paper sounded like the drawing of swords. We were not making a promise to cherish each other in sickness and in health. We were making a mutual legally binding agreement of total financial warfare. The judge stamped the marriage certificate with a heavy thud, officially binding my legal and financial identity to a billionaire venture capitalist. We walked out of the chamber and into the echoing marble corridor of the courthouse. The entire transaction had taken less than 15 minutes. Harrison stopped walking and turned to face me. His security detail immediately formed a secure perimeter around us. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew 2 items, placing them smoothly into the palm of my hand. The first was a heavy, cold piece of solid metal. It was a black titanium American Express card, stamped boldly with my new legal name. The second was a set of encrypted electronic key cards attached to a thick lanyard. Harrison held my gaze, his voice low and thrumming with absolute unwavering authority. Those keys grant you access to the secure west wing of my primary estate. Harrison explained, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. Your personal safety is now my direct responsibility. Greg is arrogant, but when he realizes his accounts are being systematically frozen, he will become incredibly desperate and volatile. You are no longer a target sitting alone in a foreclosed house. You will pack the rest of your belongings and move into my estate today. My private security team will handle the logistics. I looked down at the black titanium card resting in my palm. It represented a level of wealth, power, and protection I could barely comprehend. From this exact moment on, Olivia, you are completely untouchable, Harrison stated, securing the button of his suit jacket. Go home, gather your work equipment, and relocate to the estate immediately. DeAndre and my legal team are waiting for us in the boardroom right now. The retaliation begins today. Section 8,000 words. I walked into the glass-walled boardroom located on the top floor of Harrison Wright's private estate. The space was a fortress of modern technology, featuring interactive monitors, displaying complex financial models. A massive mahogany table anchored the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen of the most ruthless corporate litigators on the West Coast. At the head of the table, commanding the room with absolute authority, stood my brother-in-law. DeAndre had taken a leave of absence from his auditing firm to temporarily join Harrison's elite legal strike team as our lead forensic investigator. Seeing a brilliant African-American professional like DeAndre seamlessly take charge of a room full of billionaire-backed lawyers sent a surge of fierce protective pride straight through my chest. He did not wear a designer suit like the rest of the attorneys. He wore a crisp black button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, ready to tear Greg's digital life apart piece by piece. Harrison pulled out a leather chair for me at his right, signaling to everyone in the room that my authority was equal to his own. DeAndre did not waste a single second on pleasantries or legal jargon. He tapped a key on his laptop and the enormous screens surrounding the boardroom flared to life. Columns of raw banking data, encrypted routing numbers, and server logs cascaded across the walls like a digital waterfall. This was not a slow review of paper bank statements. This was a high-speed, aggressive digital hunt. DeAndre's fingers flew across his keyboard, executing scripts and cross-referencing databases in real time. He brought up the initial application for the $200,000 home equity line of credit. The document displayed my forged electronic signature at the bottom. The lawyers leaned forward, expecting a difficult battle over signature verification. DeAndre simply shook his head and smiled a calculating smile. He explained that Greg was a real estate sales director who relied on basic consumer technology, making him incredibly vulnerable to a true forensic expert. DeAndre isolated the exact timestamp of the forged signature. He ran a trace protocol on the IP address used to submit the final authorization. The screen split, showing a map of downtown Seattle alongside the server data. DeAndre rapidly pulled up Greg's cellular records, which Harrison had legally subpoenaed less than an hour ago, using an expedited judicial order. The tension in the boardroom thickened as the data merged on the screen. DeAndre was matching the geographic ping of Greg's phone to the exact location of the computer network used to steal my equity. It was a digital foot race, and Greg was losing horribly. The main screen flashed green, locking onto a specific physical address. DeAndre turned to face the room, his eyes shining with the thrill of the kill. He had found the ultimate smoking gun. He pointed to the map, identifying a local boutique coffee shop situated exactly 2 blocks away from Greg's commercial real estate office. DeAndre broke down the timeline with lethal precision. He proved that Greg had connected his personal laptop to the unsecured public Wi-Fi network at that specific coffee shop. From there, Greg accessed our joint bank account, applied the forged digital signature to the HELOC paperwork, and executed the wire transfer routing, $350,000, to Naomi's offshore shell company. But DeAndre was not finished. He brought up a secondary data log. It was the internal VPN server history from my employer. DeAndre successfully overlaid my corporate login data with Greg's fraudulent transaction timeline. The result was absolutely irrefutable. At the exact second the fraudulent documents were signed, and the money was wired from the coffee shop downtown. I was verifiably logged into my secure corporate network, conducting a video conference from my home office on the opposite side of the city. I was physically and digitally miles away from the crime scene. There was zero margin for error. DeAndre had just handed us bulletproof, undeniable proof of Greg's guilt. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted instantaneously. The corporate litigators sat back in their chairs, exchanging dark, triumphant glances. Harrison leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table, his slate eyes locked onto the undeniable evidence displaying across the digital screens. The billionaire let out a quiet breath of satisfaction. What started as a devastating personal betrayal had morphed into something entirely different. DeAndre addressed the legal team, his voice echoing with absolute finality. This was no longer a messy divorce property dispute. It was no longer a simple civil matter to be argued over in a sluggish family court for the next 3 years. By deliberately forging my signature to secure a loan from a federally insured banking institution and executing an unauthorized wire transfer across state lines into an offshore account, Greg had triggered a massive federal escalation. DeAndre clearly outlined the specific statutes. Greg had officially committed documented federal wire fraud. He had committed aggravated identity theft. He had committed bank fraud. These were heavy federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. Greg thought he was being clever by hiding behind digital screens and offshore LLCs. Instead, he handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a perfectly wrapped prosecution package. I sat frozen in my leather chair, staring at the timeline on the monitor. A profound sense of power washed over me. Greg intended to leave me bankrupt, humiliated, and begging for scraps. He wanted me trapped under the crushing weight of a stolen mortgage. But thanks to DeAndre's forensic execution and Harrison's infinite resources, the trap had been completely reversed. The snare was now wrapped tightly around Greg's own neck, and he had absolutely no idea the cord was about to snap. Harrison turned his gaze to me, a fierce, protective determination radiating from his expression. The bait was perfectly set. Now we simply needed to let Greg and Naomi walk directly into the slaughter. I felt a massive wave of vindication wash over me. The very next morning, the illusion of Greg's superiority manifested in the form of a thick, aggressively worded legal envelope delivered directly to my sister's house. Greg had hired a notoriously sleazy divorce attorney named Richard Steele. Steele was infamous around the Seattle family court circuit for bullying vulnerable spouses into submission through blatant intimidation tactics and dragging out proceedings until the opposing party ran out of funds. The demand letter was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. It completely ignored the undisputed fact that my entire life savings had been stolen. Instead, the document formally ordered me to assume 100% of the $200,000 home equity line of credit. The letter boldly stated that since the house deed was solely in my name, the debt was entirely my legal responsibility. Steele threatened that if I did not sign an immediate agreement, absorbing the massive loan and relinquishing any claim to Greg's future business assets, they would force the house into immediate foreclosure and bury me in bankruptcy court. In the past, reading a letter like that would have triggered a panic attack. I would have felt small, terrified, and completely trapped by the crushing weight of a legal threat. But sitting in Harrison Wright's impenetrable glass boardroom, surrounded by billion-dollar corporate litigators, I simply slid the letter across the mahogany table. Harrison barely glanced at the demand. He signaled to his lead litigator a shark of a woman named Veronica. Veronica did not handle messy, emotional divorces. She handled hostile corporate takeovers and multi-million-dollar asset liquidations. She took one look at the letter from Greg's attorney and smiled a smile so lethal it could cut glass. We were not going to respond with a standard family law counterproposal. We were going to drop a nuclear bomb on their entire operation. Veronica bypassed standard digital communication. She orchestrated a physical delivery designed to inflict maximum psychological terror. Harrison's team prepared a single heavy black box. Inside, they placed a pristine leather-bound copy of DeAndre's comprehensive forensic accounting report. Every stolen dollar, every intercepted verification email, and every matching IP address from the public coffee shop was meticulously highlighted in bright red ink. Right, beneath the forensic report, sat a stack of high-resolution surveillance photos Harrison's private investigators had captured. The images clearly showed Greg and Naomi confidently entering the commercial leasing office to secure their restaurant location using my stolen funds. But the absolute crown jewel of the box rested at the very bottom. It was a fully drafted, legally binding Federal Bureau of Investigation criminal complaint. The complaint explicitly named Greg as the primary suspect for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud. It detailed the exact federal statutes he had violated and the mandatory minimum prison sentences attached to each and every charge. Veronica did not ask for a negotiation. She attached a single brief cover letter stating that they had exactly 48 hours to withdraw their ridiculous civil demands before the criminal complaint was formally submitted to the United States Attorney's Office. A private uniformed courier hand delivered the heavy black box directly to the sleazy divorce attorney's downtown office, right in the middle of his afternoon client consultations. We did not have to wait 48 hours for a response. We did not even have to wait 2 hours. Exactly 47 minutes after the courier confirmed delivery, my cell phone began to ring aggressively on the boardroom table. The caller ID flashed Greg's name. The sheer predictability of his panic was almost boring. I sat back in my plush leather chair looking across the table at Harrison and DeAndre. Harrison nodded, his slate eyes gleaming with cold approval, silently giving me the floor. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear without saying a single word. Greg was absolutely losing his mind. The smooth, arrogant real estate director who had mocked my cheap clothes and called me a predictable loser was completely gone. His voice was high-pitched, breathless, and cracking with unadulterated terror. He was screaming into the receiver, demanding to know what was happening. He demanded to know who prepared that forensic report. He yelled, his breath ragged, asking how I could possibly afford to hire Veronica, one of the most terrifying and expensive corporate litigators on the West Coast. He was spiraling out of control, realizing that his amateur theft had just collided with apex predators. The shock of facing a superior force had completely shattered his fragile ego. He tried to pivot back to his usual manipulation, frantically promising that we could work this out privately. He begged me to call off the lawyers, swearing that we did not need to involve the federal authorities over a simple misunderstanding. In his absolute desperation, he even claimed that Naomi had pressured him into taking the money. It was music to my ears. He was throwing his mistress under the bus the absolute second his own freedom was threatened. I listened to him unravel for exactly 60 seconds. I let him hear the absolute chilling silence on my end of the line as his frantic apologies echoed in the quiet room. I did not scream back at him. I did not demand an apology for his horrific actions. I did not ask why he betrayed our marriage. He had lost the privilege of hearing my voice. He had lost the privilege of triggering my emotional reaction. The naive woman who used to bend over backward to constantly accommodate his fragile ego no longer existed. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red disconnect button firmly, and placed the device face down on the polished boardroom table. I officially established a new boundary of absolute impenetrable silence. The war had truly begun, and for the very first time I held all the cards. I was now perfectly ready to watch his entire world completely crumble. Section 10,000 words. With Greg spiraling into a state of total desperation, my physical safety became an immediate priority. A man stripped of his pride and backed into a legal corner is a dangerous animal. Harrison refused to leave anything to chance. That very afternoon, his private security team arrived at Rebecca's house to transport me to his primary estate. The drive through the exclusive gated community of Medina felt like entering a heavily fortified sanctuary. The massive iron gates swung open to reveal a sprawling, ultra-modern compound constructed of dark glass, reinforced steel, and sleek concrete. It was an architectural marvel almost completely hidden from the public eye. My new remote office was set up in the secure west wing of the mansion. The space was a data analyst's absolute dream. Harrison had instructed his IT department to equip the room with a bank of high-resolution curved monitors, a dedicated encrypted server, and a hyper-fast fiber optic connection. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sweeping, uninterrupted view of Lake Washington. I was completely insulated from the chaotic debris of my former life. I could do my corporate job during the day and wage financial war by night without constantly looking over my shoulder. The sheer scale of the estate meant Harrison and I could have easily gone days without crossing paths. But every evening after the regular staff had retired, we found ourselves gravitating toward the grand library on the second floor. The library was a massive two-story space filled with thousands of books, vintage leather armchairs, and a heavy mahogany table that became our shared command center. We spent hours reviewing the intricate financial data DeAndre had compiled. We were mapping out the exact corporate structure of the shell company Naomi and Greg had built. Harrison, who was usually incredibly cold and detached in his daily business dealings, sat across from me. His sleeves rolled up, a glass of bourbon resting near his hand. He watched me work with a quiet, intense focus. He observed how my fingers flew across the keyboard, executing complex data pivots and isolating hidden financial anomalies within the restaurant's projected cash flow. I was not just a wronged wife seeking petty revenge. I was a highly trained professional breaking down raw numbers into actionable intelligence. Harrison quickly realized that my analytical mind operated on the same ruthless, highly strategic frequency as his own. The dynamic between us began to shift dramatically during those quiet, late-night strategy sessions. I stopped seeing him merely as a terrifying billionaire titan, and he stopped seeing me merely as a convenient pawn in his legal chess game. One evening around 2 in the morning, the heavy silence of the library was broken by the soft clinking of ice against glass. Harrison slid a crystal tumbler of sparkling water across the mahogany table toward me. He sat back in his chair, his slate eyes studying my face with a depth of respect I had never experienced from Greg. Harrison told me that he had spent his entire life surrounded by people who simply agreed with him for a paycheck. He said it was incredibly rare to find someone who could look at a massive financial disaster and dismantle it with zero emotional hysteria. I looked back at him, seeing past the intimidating bespoke suits and the guarded exterior. I saw a man who had worked tirelessly to build an empire, only to be betrayed by a woman who viewed his hard-earned wealth as her personal playground. We were bound by the exact same brand of trauma. We had both offered loyalty to partners who viewed our devotion as a weakness to be exploited. Our shared trauma forged a quiet, unspoken bond rooted in profound mutual understanding. We did not need to exchange tearful stories about heartbreak or wallow in self-pity. Our healing was taking place through action strategy and absolute accountability. I began to notice the subtle, honorable traits beneath Harrison's armored exterior. He ensured my favorite coffee roast was always stocked in the kitchen. He quietly ordered his security detail to patrol the perimeter of my sister's neighborhood, making sure Rebecca and DeAndre were completely protected from any potential retaliation by Greg. He did not boast about these protective measures. He simply executed them because it was the right thing to do. My chest tightened with a strange, unfamiliar warmth whenever he entered the room. The intellectual chemistry between us was undeniable. We anticipated each other's tactical moves, finishing each other's sentences when analyzing the corporate ledgers. The air in the library grew thick with a crackling electric tension. I found myself hyper-aware of his physical proximity, the deep resonance of his voice, and the lingering intensity of his gaze whenever our eyes met over the financial documents. We were two betrayed souls who had collided in the dark, and we were rapidly forging an unbreakable alliance that felt terrifyingly real. One moment on Thursday night crystallized everything between us. The freezing rain was gently tapping against the glass windows of the library. I had just cracked a heavily encrypted folder linking Greg to a new shady vendor. I smiled a genuine fierce smile of absolute victory and looked up at him. Harrison was already watching me, his slate eyes dark and incredibly focused. He leaned across the mahogany table, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He told me I was the most dangerous woman he had ever met, and his voice held a level of raw reverence that made my heart race. In that quiet, charged space, the boundaries of our rigid contract began to blur. We were no longer just two fragile victims seeking vengeance. We were true partners preparing to burn our enemies to the ground. The very next morning, the depth of Greg and Naomi's sheer arrogance reached an entirely new level. I was sitting at the mahogany table in the library, reviewing the final injunction paperwork with DeAndre, when his cell phone chimed with a message from my sister. Rebecca had just retrieved the morning mail from their porch. She sent a high-resolution photograph of a thick, heavy cream envelope sealed with gold wax. Inside the envelope was a heavily embossed, incredibly ostentatious VIP invitation. The elegant cursive text formally requested the honor of her presence at the highly anticipated grand opening gala for a luxury restaurant named El Aura. The names of the proud new owners and hosts were printed in bold gold lettering at the very bottom of the card. Greg and Naomi. They had actually sent an exclusive grand opening invitation to my own sister. It was a calculated, deliberate insult. Greg knew exactly how close Rebecca and I were. He knew I was staying with her before Harrison relocated me to the estate. Sending that invitation was not an oversight. It was a vicious, mocking taunt. Greg and Naomi firmly believed they had successfully stolen my $350,000, secured their commercial lease, and entirely outsmarted everyone in their path. They thought I was currently sitting in a cheap motel somewhere crying over my empty bank account and desperately trying to figure out how to avoid bankruptcy. They wanted my family to attend their lavish celebration purely to witness their stolen triumph and report my total humiliation back to me. I stared at the glowing screen of DeAndre's phone, my jaw clenching so tight my teeth ached. The absolute audacity required to steal a woman's entire life savings and then invite her family to celebrate the crime was staggering. I slid the phone across the table toward Harrison. He had just walked into the library carrying a fresh cup of coffee. He set the cup down, picked up the phone, and read the glowing invitation. I expected Harrison to be angry, but instead a cold, terrifyingly predatory smile spread across his face. He gently placed the phone back onto the polished mahogany surface. He looked at me, his slate-gray eyes darkening with the promise of absolute ruin. "They truly believe they have won," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "They think they are the apex predators of Seattle. It is time to show them exactly who they stole from." The decision was made in that exact moment. We were not going to ignore the insulting invitation. We were not going to hide in the estate while they drank expensive champagne bought with my hard-earned savings. We were going to walk directly through the front doors of El Aura and completely decimate their entire reality. Harrison immediately summoned his personal styling team to the estate. This was not going to be a cliché emotional makeover montage. I did not need a team to fix my self-esteem or make me feel pretty. I needed to be armed for battle. I needed to physically manifest the absolute untouchable power of my new reality. I was walking into a room full of Seattle's wealthiest investors, socialites, and real estate moguls. I needed to look like a woman who owned the very ground they walked on. The stylists worked with ruthless efficiency. They pulled my hair into a sharp, elegant chignon that highlighted the severe angles of my face and exposed the long line of my neck. They applied makeup that was striking and fierce, focusing on sharp contours and a deep, commanding lip color. But the true armor was the gown Harrison had specifically selected for the evening. It was a breathtaking floor-length designer creation in a shade of emerald green so deep it almost looked black. The silk fabric clung perfectly to my frame, featuring a structured asymmetrical neckline that radiated pure lethal confidence. I slipped into a pair of towering designer heels that forced my posture perfectly straight. When I finally looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of the dressing room, the boring, predictable data analyst Greg had discarded was completely gone. The woman staring back at me looked like an absolute monarch. I looked dangerous. I looked entirely untouchable. Harrison waited for me at the bottom of the grand sweeping staircase in the main foyer of the estate. He wore a masterfully tailored jet-black tuxedo that made his broad shoulders look incredibly imposing. The silver at his temples caught the light of the crystal chandelier overhead. As I slowly descended the steps, the quiet conversation he was having with his head of security came to an abrupt halt. Harrison turned to face me, and the look of raw, unfiltered admiration in his slate eyes sent a sudden electric jolt straight down my spine. He did not offer a cheap compliment. He simply extended his arm, his gaze locked onto mine with burning intensity. "You look ready to end them," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled heavily in the quiet air of the foyer. "I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life," I replied, slipping my hand smoothly through the crook of his arm. The physical contact sent a spark of undeniable heat between us, cementing our formidable alliance. This was the exact moment the balance of power permanently shifted out of my ex-husband's control. We walked out of the massive front doors of the estate and stepped into the crisp Seattle evening. The black Rolls-Royce was already idling by the front steps, the driver holding the rear door open. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, Harrison taking his place right beside me. As the heavy door shut, sealing us inside the quiet cabin, my heart hammered with fierce anticipation. We were heading downtown. They thought they stole my future. They had actually just financed their own execution. Greg raised his hand high in the air and sharply snapped his fingers. The sharp sound cut through the ambient noise of clinking champagne glasses and the low thrum of the string quartet, playing in the corner. He gestured aggressively toward the two burly security guards stationed near the velvet ropes of the VIP entrance. Greg stood with his chest puffed out, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He believed he was the absolute master of his domain. I thought he was swatting away a minor annoyance. He had no idea he had just ordered the removal of the apex predator of the Seattle financial sector. The two massive security guards immediately stepped forward, their faces arranged in identical expressions of professional intimidation. They moved briskly across the polished marble floor, fully intending to grab my arms and forcefully escort me out into the cold night. Greg crossed his arms, looking at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. Naomi stood right beside him, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder, the stolen diamonds glittering violently against her skin. She wore a look of supreme satisfaction, waiting for the humiliating spectacle of my physical removal. Before the guards could even come within a 3-foot radius of us, Harrison executed a flawless, imperceptible shift in his stance. He moved just half a step, placing himself slightly in front of me. It was not a dramatic, flailing gesture. It was the calm, rooted movement of a man who commanded entire boardrooms and decimated hostile corporations before his morning coffee. Harrison raised a single hand palm, facing outward. The gesture was completely silent, but it carried an aura of such absolute, terrifying authority that both security guards instantly froze in their tracks. They exchanged a look of sudden, profound uncertainty. At that exact moment, the general manager of the restaurant, a man named Marcus, who had been bustling around ensuring the investors were perfectly catered to, caught sight of the commotion. Marcus rushed forward to assist his new bosses, wiping his hands nervously on his tailored trousers. He opened his mouth, prepared to bark an order at the security team to hurry up and remove the unwanted guests. But as Marcus closed the distance, his eyes landed squarely on the tall, silver-haired man standing protectively in front of me. The general manager stopped dead. All the color instantly vanished from his face, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. His jaw went completely slack. Marcus had spent decades working in the high-end hospitality industry, catering to the ultra-wealthy elite of the Pacific Northwest. He knew exactly who held the real power in this city. He recognized the notoriously ruthless venture capitalist standing in the middle of his dining room. Mr. Wright. Marcus gasped, his voice trembling so violently that the surrounding guests turned to look. Mr. Harrison Wright, I had absolutely no idea you were attending tonight. We are so profoundly honored to have you here. The name dropped into the crowded room like a lead weight. Harrison Wright. Half the investors standing in the VIP section suddenly stiffened. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. The wealthy socialites and real estate moguls who had been laughing with Greg just moments ago went entirely rigid. Harrison was a phantom in the media, a man who intentionally avoided photographs and public galas, but his reputation among the financial elite was legendary. How was the man who could bankrupt a company with a single phone call? He was the invisible handing hundreds of millions of dollars across the global market. And right now, he was standing in the middle of a restaurant funded by stolen money. Greg frowned, clearly annoyed that his security team had halted, and his general manager was bowing and scraping before my unknown guest. Greg was a mid-level sales director. He operated in a flashy, superficial world of leased cars and leveraged debt. He did not recognize true, quiet generational wealth. He stepped forward, clearly irritated by the sudden shift in the room's dynamic. Marcus, what is the holdup? Greg demanded, puffing his chest out again. I told you to have these two removed. I do not care who this guy thinks he is. This is my restaurant. I am the owner here. Harrison finally lowered his hand. He looked at Greg with a level of cold detachment that was absolutely terrifying to witness. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, crushing certainty of a man observing an insect on his shoe. You are Gregory, Harrison stated. It was not a question. The man who forged his wife's electronic signature to secure a $200,000 line of credit. The man who committed federal wire fraud to fund a commercial lease. Greg flinched, taking a sudden involuntary step backward. The smug smirk completely melted off his face. His eyes darted wildly around the room, realizing that the surrounding investors were listening to every single word. Who the hell are you? Greg stammered, his voice losing all its previous bravado. How do you know about that? Harrison ignored the frantic questions. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke midnight blue suit jacket. He withdrew a sleek silver business card and held it between his fingers. He did not hand it to Greg. He merely let it catch the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. My name is Harrison Wright. He introduced himself, his slate eyes locking onto Greg's terrified face. I am a senior partner at Vanguard Capital. I am also the man whose legal team currently possesses the IP logs and forensic accounting reports detailing every single unauthorized transaction you made from that public coffee shop downtown. Greg stopped breathing. The reality of his situation crashed into him like a physical blow. The man he thought was just my random dinner date was actually a billionaire titan holding the blueprint to his federal indictment. But the true devastation of the moment did not belong to Greg. It belonged to the woman standing right behind him. I shifted my gaze past my crumbling ex-husband and locked eyes with Naomi. When Harrison had spoken, Naomi had physically violently recoiled. I watched in absolute fascination as every drop of blood drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her skin turned a sickly ashen gray. The smug, condescending sneer she had worn just seconds ago vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Her hands began to shake so severely that her champagne flute rattled against her diamond rings. Naomi stared at her billionaire husband. Then her terrified eyes slowly tracked over to me. She looked at my hand resting securely and intimately in the crook of Harrison's arm. The catastrophic truth clicked into place inside her mind. She realized that her secret safety net was completely compromised. She realized that her husband, the man she planned to blindside with divorce papers, was allied with the very woman she had instructed Greg to rob. Harrison turned his gaze slightly, finally acknowledging his wife for the first time that evening. He did not shout. He did not cause a scene. He simply delivered the final fatal strike with perfect composure. Hello, Naomi, Harrison said smoothly. I must say I am incredibly disappointed in your financial strategy. If you wanted to build an escape fund, you should have chosen an accomplice who actually knows how to cover his digital tracks. Naomi's lips parted, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed. The entire restaurant had gone dead silent. The investors, the socialites, and the staff were all watching the destruction of the proud new owners. I stood tall in my emerald gown, radiating a lethal, untouchable confidence. Greg and Naomi thought they had buried me. Instead, they had just dug their own shallow graves right in the middle of their grand opening. Greg stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. His eyes darted frantically from Harrison to me, then back to the billionaire whose very name had just paralyzed the entire VIP dining room. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic broken stammer escaped his throat. He shook his head violently, desperately attempting to reject the reality crashing down around him. Greg finally managed to find his voice, insisting loudly that this was completely impossible. He puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his shattered pride in front of the wealthy investors watching his meltdown. He declared that he was the sole legal owner of this establishment, and that no one had the authority to walk into his building and threaten him with cyber logs or forensic audits. He shouted that he had legally secured the capital to open this place and that Harrison was bluffing to scare him. Harrison did not raise his voice to match Greg's frantic, unhinged energy. He did not need to shout to command the room. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his tailored midnight blue suit jacket. He withdrew a single neatly folded legal document, printed on thick, watermarked corporate paper. He did not hand it to Greg immediately. Instead, Harrison held it out suspended in the air, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room to amplify the weight of the moment. The surrounding investors leaned in, their eyes fixed intently on the paper. Greg stared at the document as if it were a live explosive device. He finally reached out with a trembling, sweaty hand and took it. As Greg's eyes scanned the complex legal jargon covering the page, the last remaining drops of arrogance completely drained from his body. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of a velvet rope stanchion just to remain standing. Harrison turned his attention to the crowd of wealthy Seattle elites, projecting his voice effortlessly so every single investor, socialite, and staff member could hear the financial autopsy he was about to perform. He decided to explain high-level corporate finance to the terrified couple, making sure everyone in the room understood exactly how incompetent Greg truly was. Harrison explained that opening a luxury dining establishment in the most expensive, highly coveted commercial district of downtown Seattle required a tremendous amount of capital. He looked back at Greg and Naomi, who were practically shrinking under his intense, predatory gaze. Harrison detailed how the $350,000 Greg stole from my home equity line of credit was an absolute joke in the high-end hospitality industry. That stolen money was barely enough to secure the first year of the prime commercial lease and bribe a few city officials for expedited construction permits. To actually build the restaurant, Harrison continued, his voice ringing with lethal clarity. Greg needed millions. To pay for the imported Italian marble floors, we were standing on the cascading crystal chandeliers hanging overhead, the elite kitchen staff, and the massive marketing campaign. Greg needed a serious injection of cash. He needed exactly $2.4 million. Since Greg had completely exhausted his legitimate credit by forging my electronic signature for the initial funds, no traditional federally insured bank would ever approve a $2 million commercial loan for his vanity project. So Greg went looking for fast, aggressive, unregulated capital. He eagerly signed a massive funding agreement with a predatory private equity firm known for backing high-risk hospitality ventures. Harrison paused, allowing a slow, razor-sharp smile to touch his lips. He looked directly at Naomi, whose hands were gripping her designer clutch so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. Harrison revealed the ultimate trap. He announced to the dead silent room that he was the silent majority stakeholder of that exact private equity firm. The money Greg borrowed to build the restaurant, the very capital that paid for the champagne currently sitting in Naomi's glass, belonged entirely to Harrison Wright. Greg dropped the legal document onto the marble floor, his breathing ragged and shallow. Harrison stepped forward, closing the distance, completely dominating the physical space between them. He explained the fatal flaw in Greg's incredibly sloppy business plan. The private equity contract Greg signed contained a deeply buried, highly complex financial covenant. It was a standard, non-negotiable security clause, requiring all foundational capital invested by the borrower to be legally obtained and fully transparent. Because Greg used stolen funds from a fraudulent home equity line of credit to secure the initial commercial lease, he instantly violated the core covenant of the massive commercial loan. Greg had been so desperate to play the role of a wealthy, untouchable restaurateur that he never bothered to have a competent corporate lawyer read the fine print of his funding agreement. Harrison delivered the final devastating blow with clinical precision. He announced that due to the immediate and documented breach of contract regarding the stolen foundational funds, his private equity firm had legally executed a hostile takeover of the entire asset just 2 hours prior to the grand opening. The trap was completely closed. Harrison firmly stated that he now owned 80% of the equity in the restaurant they were standing in. The building, the brand, the liquor license, and the revenue stream all belonged to him. Greg and Naomi were instantly reduced to powerless minority shareholders, holding a worthless 20% stake with absolutely zero voting rights. They were standing in a building they no longer controlled, hosting a party they could no longer afford. I stood perfectly still in my emerald gown, my heart soaring with a fierce, burning vindication as I watched my ex-husband realize he had essentially built a multi-million-dollar empire just to hand the keys directly to the man who was currently holding my hand. Section 15,000 words. The silence that followed Harrison's declaration was absolute, broken only by the sharp, ragged sound of Naomi gasping for air. The terrifying reality of her situation had finally breached the walls of her delusion. She had risked everything to build a secret safety net, only to discover she had spent months constructing her own financial prison. For a moment she stood completely frozen, staring at the legal document resting on the marble floor. Then the polished, sophisticated facade she had meticulously maintained for the wealthy investors completely shattered. She did not just get angry, she went absolutely feral. Naomi whipped her head around to face Greg, her eyes wild and blazing with a venomous fury. Her voice, previously a smooth and airy purr, ripped through the dining room in an ear-splitting shriek. She lunged at him, her manicured fingers curling into claws as she shoved him hard in the chest. She screamed that he was a catastrophic idiot. She demanded to know how he could possibly be so incredibly stupid to sign a multi-million-dollar private equity contract without having a competent lawyer review every single covenant. She called him a pathetic amateur, an incompetent failure who had just single-handedly destroyed her entire life. Her words echoed off the crystal chandeliers, loud and unhinged, exposing the incredibly shallow foundation of their supposed romance. Greg stumbled backward from the force of her shove, his face flushing a deep, violent crimson. The public humiliation of being berated by his mistress, in front of Seattle's financial elite, instantly ignited his own explosive temper. He threw his hands up, stepping aggressively back toward her. He did not attempt to calm her down or take responsibility. Instead, he fired right back, matching her volume and ferocity. He screamed that she was the one who pressured him into moving too quickly. He yelled that she had relentlessly harassed him day and night to steal the money from my account because she was terrified Harrison would discover her infidelity before she secured her escape fund. Greg pointed a trembling finger directly in her face, blaming her greed and her impatience for blinding him to the fine print of the funding agreements. The argument devolved into a vicious, deeply humiliating public spectacle. They traded horrific insults, exposing the ugly, toxic core of their alliance. Naomi shrieked that she never actually loved him, claiming she only tolerated his boring middle-class existence because she thought he was a useful tool to secure her financial independence. Greg roared back, calling her a worthless parasite who contributed absolutely nothing but demands and complaints. They completely forgot about Harrison. They completely forgot about me. They were two cornered rats turning on each other in a desperate, futile attempt to escape the sinking ship they had built together. The wealthy investors, socialites, and real estate moguls watched the screaming match with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. The general manager Marcus signaled to the waitstaff to subtly back away from the escalating chaos. No one intervened. No one offered them sympathy. They were watching a spectacular career suicide playing out in real time. The elite crowd whispered amongst themselves, their judgment sealing Greg and Naomi's permanent exile from high society. Harrison stood perfectly still beside me, his hand resting reassuringly against the small of my back. He observed their feral meltdown, with the detached clinical interest of a scientist, watching a failed experiment combust. He let them scream and tear each other apart for 2 full minutes, allowing the wealthy attendees to witness the absolute lack of class and business acumen possessed by the former owners. When the spectacle reached a point of pathetic redundancy, Harrison decided the show was officially over. He raised his hand a second time. The two massive security guards, the exact same men Greg had arrogantly summoned to remove me just moments prior, immediately snapped to attention. Harrison did not raise his voice above a conversational volume, yet his command carried across the entire room with lethal authority. He looked at the security team and smoothly instructed them to escort the minority shareholders off the premises. He stated that their behavior was entirely unacceptable for a luxury establishment and that they were permanently banned from re-entering the property. Greg stopped screaming mid-sentence. Naomi froze her mouth, hanging open in sheer disbelief. The two security guards advanced rapidly, their expressions entirely devoid of pity. One guard grabbed Greg firmly by the arm, spinning him toward the exit. The second guard stepped in front of Naomi, instructing her to walk toward the door immediately or face physical removal. Greg tried to resist, stammering about his rights, but the guard easily overpowered him, twisting his arm behind his back and marching him forcefully across the Italian marble floor. Naomi let out a final pathetic wail, stumbling in her designer heels as she was corralled toward the front doors. I stood rooted to my spot, my posture perfectly straight, my chin held high. I watched the man who had stolen my life savings and the woman who had mocked my existence get physically dragged out of the building they thought they owned. They were shoved through the heavy glass doors and out into the freezing Seattle rain, the exact same way Greg had thrown me out just weeks before. A massive, overwhelming wave of vindication washed through my entire body. It started in my chest and radiated out to my fingertips, replacing every ounce of grief, betrayal, and humiliation I had carried. I did not have to shed a single tear. I did not have to beg for my dignity. I did not have to raise my voice once. I had simply partnered with the right ally, analyzed the data, and let their own boundless arrogance orchestrate their total destruction. The civil victory was completely flawless, but I knew the criminal reckoning for their stolen money was just beginning. The morning after the grand opening disaster, the atmosphere inside Harrison's estate was electric with focused, lethal energy. We had humiliated Greg and Naomi in front of Seattle's financial elite, stripping them of their prized restaurant and publicly exposing their incompetence. But public humiliation and a hostile corporate takeover were only the preliminary steps in our overarching strategy. A civil victory, no matter how profoundly satisfying, simply was not enough to balance the scales. Greg had not just made a poor business decision. He had actively forged my signature, stolen my life savings, and saddled me with a massive amount of fraudulent debt. He belonged in a federal penitentiary, and today was the day we officially handed him over to the authorities. We gathered in the Grand Library right after breakfast. The mahogany table, previously covered in corporate lease agreements and private equity contracts, was now stacked high with heavily redacted bank records, printed IP logs, and thick legal binders. DeAndre stood at the head of the table, looking incredibly sharp after working through the night to finalize his forensic accounting report. Veronica sat to my left, her posture rigid and alert, ready to translate DeAndre's financial data into a lethal prosecutorial package. Harrison stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the gray waters of Lake Washington, holding a cup of black coffee. He turned to face the room, giving DeAndre a single nod to begin the briefing. DeAndre activated the large digital monitor mounted on the wall. He did not smile. He was in absolute professional mode, operating as the premier forensic investigator he was. He pulled up a flowchart that mapped the exact journey of my stolen $350,000. He began by breaking down the initial offense. When Greg sat in that public coffee shop and intercepted the verification emails to apply my forged electronic signature to the home equity line of credit, he committed aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. Because he used the internet to transmit those fraudulent loan documents to a federally insured banking institution, he immediately triggered the federal wire fraud statute. That alone carried a terrifying mandatory minimum prison sentence. But Greg, in his boundless arrogance, did not stop there. DeAndre clicked a button, and the digital flowchart expanded, showing a complex web of international bank transfers. Greg and Naomi knew they could not simply deposit a stolen lump sum of that magnitude into a local business checking account without triggering immediate alerts from the Internal Revenue Service. They needed to clean the money. DeAndre explained the fundamental mechanics of their crime. They moved the stolen capital from my compromised bank account directly into an offshore limited liability company registered in the Cayman Islands. They let the money sit in that offshore account for 3 weeks to create a layer of separation. Then they wired the funds back into the United States, depositing the cash into the corporate accounts of the Nova Horizons Group under the guise of an anonymous foreign investment. This, DeAndre stated, his voice echoing with absolute authority, constitutes textbook money laundering. It is the literal definition of the crime. They took illicitly gained capital, funneled it through a foreign entity to conceal its origin, and integrated it back into the domestic economy to fund a legitimate food and beverage enterprise. By using the restaurant as a front to wash the stolen home equity funds, Greg and Naomi elevated their amateur theft into a highly sophisticated, multi-jurisdictional federal crime syndicate. DeAndre pointed to the screen, his dark eyes locked onto the undeniable data. The financial trail was so brutally clear, so perfectly documented, that any competent federal prosecutor could secure a conviction blindfolded. Veronica leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished mahogany. She was absolutely thrilled. Corporate litigators rarely got handed a criminal referral package so flawlessly executed. She explained the next tactical phase. We were not going to simply drop a tip to a local police precinct. Harrison possessed extensive high-level contacts within the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Veronica detailed how the IRS would be particularly interested in the offshore components of the crime. Moving hundreds of thousands of dollars through an undeclared foreign account to evade domestic tracking is a massive red flag for federal tax investigators. The government does not look kindly upon citizens hiding illicit capital in the Cayman Islands. I sat at the table absorbing the sheer magnitude of the trap we had constructed. I looked at the printed logs, the routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of my ex-husband's greed. Greg thought he was playing a brilliant game of high-stakes Monopoly. He thought he was a real estate mogul building an empire. Instead, he was just a common thief, leaving a neon-glowing trail of digital breadcrumbs directly to his own doorstep. He had handed us the very rope we were going to use to hang him. Harrison walked over to the table and placed his coffee cup down. He looked at Veronica, his slate eyes cold and entirely merciless. He asked if the criminal complaint was ready for formal submission. Veronica confirmed that the dossier was perfect. Every single page had been verified, every IP address cross-referenced, and every statutory violation clearly outlined. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction. I felt a deep, steady rhythm thumping in my chest. I gave the final authorization. I looked at DeAndre and Veronica and told them to send it. Veronica picked up her encrypted phone and dialed a direct number. She did not have to wait on hold. She spoke quietly and urgently to a senior contact at the federal prosecutor's office, informing them that a courier was en route with a comprehensive evidence package detailing a multi-million-dollar money laundering and wire fraud operation. She ended the call and dispatched her fastest, most trusted legal courier to deliver the heavy black boxes directly to the federal building downtown. The action was remarkably quiet, devoid of any dramatic explosions or screaming matches, yet it carried the weight of absolute finality. The documents were officially submitted. The massive grinding gears of the federal justice system had been set into motion, and there was absolutely no turning back. I stood up from my leather chair, walking over to the window to look out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere in that city, Greg was likely waking up in a panic, trying to figure out how to salvage his shattered restaurant and his ruined reputation. He had no idea that his civil problems were already entirely irrelevant. The clock was officially ticking down to his absolute inescapable destruction. Section 17,000 words. The clock was officially ticking down to his absolute inescapable destruction. Greg did not know about the criminal referral yet. The total loss of his restaurant had already pushed him to the absolute brink of insanity. He was a man accustomed to manipulating his way out of minor inconveniences, but he was entirely unequipped to handle a total systemic collapse. In his frantic, desperate state, he assumed I was still hiding out in the eastern suburbs. He had no idea I was currently sitting behind the fortified gates of a billionaire's estate. He thought I was still the vulnerable, predictable woman he had discarded. Later that same afternoon, the security cameras surrounding my sister's property triggered a proximity alert directly to DeAndre's encrypted phone. We pulled up the live feed on the boardroom monitors. A battered rideshare vehicle jerked to a halt in front of Rebecca's house. Greg stumbled out onto the wet pavement. He looked absolutely atrocious. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and stained with rain. His tie was completely missing and his hair stood in wild, unkempt patches. He marched up the driveway, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He reached the front porch and began pounding his fists against the heavy wooden door, screaming my name at the top of his lungs. He screamed that we could negotiate a fair settlement, that Naomi tricked him, and that I needed to call off my attack dogs before things got entirely out of hand. He genuinely still believed he possessed bargaining power. He thought this was a simple domestic dispute he could charm his way out of. DeAndre did not call the local police. He calmly closed his laptop in the boardroom, stating he would handle this physical intrusion personally. DeAndre drove back to his neighborhood, arriving just as Greg picked up a heavy garden stone, threatening to smash the front window if I did not come out. DeAndre stepped out of his vehicle and walked up the driveway with terrifying composure. As an African-American man operating at the pinnacle of forensic accounting, DeAndre had spent his career navigating an industry that scrutinized his every move. He built an utterly pristine, bulletproof reputation by working twice as hard and leaving absolutely zero margin for error. He did not tolerate sloppy accounting, and he certainly did not tolerate a sloppy, arrogant thief screaming on his porch. DeAndre ascended the steps. Greg dropped the stone, his chest heaving as he pointed a trembling finger at my brother-in-law. He demanded DeAndre bring me outside immediately. He yelled that he was willing to sign the house over to me if I forced Harrison to return his restaurant equity. He begged, claiming his life was ruined and he just needed one break. DeAndre did not raise his voice. He simply stood on his porch looking down at Greg with a level of clinical surgical disdain. DeAndre told Greg to lower his voice and step back from the door. When Greg tried to interrupt, DeAndre cut him off with a tone so sharp it practically drew blood. DeAndre systematically dismantled Greg's arrogant existence. He explained that Greg was nothing but a fragile, incompetent amateur who thought he could play a high-stakes financial game without understanding the basic rules of the board. DeAndre detailed how he spent years meticulously tracking brilliant corporate criminals who utilized complex algorithms to hide assets. Tracing Greg's stolen home equity loan was the easiest, most insulting task he had ever performed. Greg opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. The reality of his absolute incompetence was finally piercing his delusion. DeAndre reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded stack of papers. He calmly handed the documents to Greg. Greg took the papers with shaking hands. It was a direct copy of the tracking ledger submitted to the authorities earlier that morning. Greg's eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the highlighted IP addresses, timestamps from the public coffee shop, and offshore routing numbers. DeAndre had mapped out every single stolen cent, presenting it in a format so clear a child could understand the fraud. Greg's face drained of all color. He looked up at DeAndre, sheer panic vibrating through his body. He realized this was not a draft for a divorce negotiation. This was a completed, airtight forensic audit proving massive, deliberate theft. DeAndre stepped closer, invading Greg's physical space, delivering the final, devastating blow with quiet, lethal precision. He looked Greg dead in the eye and delivered a warning that effectively ended the man's life as he knew it. "You did not just steal from my sister-in-law. DeAndre stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. You committed federal crimes on my watch. You brought wire fraud and money laundering right to my family's doorstep. You actually thought you were smart enough to get away with it. Greg tried to take a step backward, but his legs were trembling too violently. He clutched the tracking ledger against his chest like a shield that could not possibly protect him. The feds have the file, DeAndre told him quietly, letting the words sink directly into Greg's panicked mind. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation received this exact ledger this morning. You are out of time, Greg. You are out of negotiations, and you are entirely out of options. Do not ever come back to my property. Go home and wait for the knock. DeAndre turned his back on the broken man, unlocked his front door, and walked inside, shutting it firmly. Greg was left standing entirely alone in the damp cold, clutching the undeniable proof of his own federal indictment. He arrived at the house loudly demanding a deal, demanding control, and demanding attention. He left with the cold, terrifying realization that his freedom was now officially measured in mere hours. The weekend passed in a state of suffocating paranoia for Greg. By the time Monday morning arrived, the crushing reality of DeAndre's warning had fully consumed him. The sun had not yet risen over downtown Seattle, casting the city's streets in a dull, muted gray. Inside the lavishly decorated private office of the restaurant, Greg was currently engaging in an act of absolute pathetic desperation. He was frantically attempting to empty the commercial wall safe. He had bypassed sleep entirely, fueled by sheer panic and the terrifying knowledge that the federal authorities possessed the exact ledger of his crimes. He shoved stacks of weekend cash deposits into a cheap nylon gym bag, his hands shaking so violently he dropped several bundles onto the imported Italian tile. His tailored suit was long gone, replaced by a dark hoodie and sweatpants. He looked exactly like the common criminal he was. He delusionally believed that if he could just scrape together enough physical cash, he could flee across the border into Canada or secure a flight to a non-extradition country before the authorities finalized their warrants. He scrambled to the mahogany desk, aggressively typing his administrative password into the main terminal. He planned to drain the remaining operational funds from the restaurant's checking account, completely ignoring the fact that Harrison legally owned 80% of the establishment. As the computer screen flared to life, a loud, sharp screech of heavy tires tearing across wet asphalt shattered the early morning silence. Greg froze, his finger hovering over the mouse. He slowly turned his head toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the street. 3 massive black SUVs abruptly hopped the curb, swerving aggressively onto the sidewalk directly in front of the restaurant's main entrance. The doors of the vehicles flew open simultaneously. More than a dozen federal agents poured out, their movements highly coordinated and utterly ruthless. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy utility belts, and windbreakers stamped with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. Greg stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat as raw terror seized his entire body. He scrambled away from the desk, clutching the half-filled gym bag of cash to his chest, looking wildly for a rear exit. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant did not just open. They were forcefully breached. The sound of shattered glass and splintering wood echoed through the empty dining room as the strike team poured into the establishment. Heavy boots trampled over the imported marble floors, completely ruining the pristine aesthetic Greg had stolen my money to build. Federal agents, show me your hands right now. The booming authoritative command reverberated through the hallway leading to the back office. Flashlights cut through the dim lighting, sweeping aggressively across the walls. Greg backed himself into the corner of the office, his back hitting the expensive wallpaper. The door to his office was kicked open with shattering force. 3 armed agents flooded the small room, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at his chest. Drop the bag. Get on the ground. Put your hands behind your head. Greg dropped the gym bag. Stacks of stolen cash spilled out, fluttering pathetically to the floor around his feet. He slowly lowered himself to his knees, sobbing openly. He did not look like an ambitious real estate mogul or a powerful restaurant owner. He looked like a terrified, broken man who had finally run out of lies. The agents forcefully pushed him flat onto the ground, pressing his cheek against the cold tile. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists signaled the absolute end of his freedom. While two agents hauled Greg to his feet, reading him his Miranda rights, in a flat, clinical tone, the rest of the federal strike team initiated a brutal, systematic raid of the property. The scene was chaotic, loud, and incredibly satisfying to witness. The agents immediately unplugged the main computer terminals, seizing every digital device in the building. They boxed up filing cabinets, confiscated employee records, and tagged the commercial safe as federal evidence. The Internal Revenue Service agents formally executed asset freeze protocols on all accounts associated with the Nova Horizons Group, shutting down the entire financial operation in a matter of minutes. The restaurant was completely dismantled. The agents grabbed Greg by his upper arms and marched him out of the office. They dragged him through the main dining area, past the cascading crystal chandeliers and the velvet ropes he had arrogantly stood behind just days earlier. As they pushed him through the shattered front doors and out onto the Seattle sidewalk, a chaotic explosion of bright white flashes erupted. Veronica and Harrison's legal team had ensured that the local morning news affiliates received an anonymous, highly detailed tip regarding a major federal raid on a high-profile downtown restaurant. 3 news vans were parked across the street, their satellite dishes raised and cameras rolling. A swarm of reporters pushed against the police barricades, shouting aggressive questions at Greg as the agents paraded him toward the waiting SUVs. Greg tried to duck his head, hiding his face from the blinding camera flashes, but the agents held him firmly upright, ensuring his public walk of shame was captured from every possible angle. The cameras filmed the disgraced real estate director wearing a cheap hoodie and steel handcuffs flanked by federal agents. They captured his tear-stained, panicked face as he was shoved roughly into the back of a federal vehicle. In that single, highly publicized moment, Greg's entire existence was completely annihilated. The local news stations would broadcast the footage of his arrest on a continuous loop for the rest of the day. His real estate brokerage would terminate his employment contract the second the broadcast aired to avoid the catastrophic public relations fallout. His professional network would instantly blacklist him, cutting ties with a man accused of federal wire fraud and money laundering. His reputation was burned to ashes on live television. Back at Harrison's secure estate, we sat in the Grand Library, watching the live local news broadcast on the massive wall monitor. The screen displayed the bold red breaking news banner as the anchor detailed the FBI raid. I watched the agents push Greg into the back of the SUV, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel sadness for the man I had once loved. I felt a profound, overwhelming surge of pure justice. The scales had finally been balanced. I had stolen my savings and tried to destroy my future in the dark, hoping no one would notice. I had dragged his crimes into the blinding light of a federal indictment, and I had ensured that the entire world watched his absolute downfall. The trap had perfectly executed its purpose. But as the news anchor transitioned to discussing the potential accomplices involved in the money laundering scheme, I knew we had one final target left to dismantle. Naomi was about to discover that running to a billionaire for mercy was the worst possible mistake she could ever make. The iron gates of the estate buzzed shortly after the news broadcast concluded. DeAndre checked the security monitors and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He pointed to a sleek white luxury SUV idling frantically at the entrance. It was Naomi. She was relentlessly pressing the call button, desperate to gain entry. She had seen the news of Greg being dragged out of the restaurant in handcuffs. She knew the federal authorities were actively dismantling the shell company, and she knew her name was scattered all over those fraudulent lease agreements. In a state of sheer panic, she decided to run back to the only fortress she thought could protect her. She assumed her billionaire husband would shield her from prison if she played the role of a naive, manipulated wife. Harrison stood by the window, locking his slate eyes onto the security feed. He pressed a button instructing his security team to open the gates and escort his wife directly to the Grand Library. He wanted this confrontation to happen exactly here on his territory, surrounded by his legal counsel. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors swung open. Naomi stumbled into the room. The flawless socialite who had mocked my clothing at the grand opening was completely gone. Her designer makeup was streaked with desperate tears. Her blonde hair hung in messy clumps around her face. She was hyperventilating, clutching an expensive crocodile skin handbag against her chest like a shield. When she saw Harrison standing at the mahogany table, she let out a loud, theatrical sob. She ignored my presence entirely, collapsing directly onto her knees at Harrison's feet. It was a pathetic, calculated performance. She grabbed the hem of his suit jacket, burying her tear-stained face into the fabric. She cried out that she was incredibly sorry. She screamed that Greg was a sociopath who had entirely manipulated her. She claimed Greg forced her into signing the commercial lease documents and that she had absolutely no idea the initial capital was stolen from my home equity line of credit. Looking up at Harrison with wide, pleading eyes, she swore she never actually loved Greg. She declared that Harrison was her only true love and begged him to protect her. Harrison looked down at the weeping woman. He did not reach out to comfort her. He slowly stepped backward, forcing her hands to slip off his jacket. The look of absolute disgust on his face was chilling. He told her to get up off the floor and stop insulting his intelligence. He stated he had already reviewed the security footage, the bank routing numbers, and the encrypted emails she personally sent to Greg detailing the offshore accounts. He knew she was the architect of the escape fund. He knew she had weaponized Greg's massive ego to execute the theft because she was too cowardly to steal the money herself. Naomi scrambled to her feet, her breathing shallow. She tried to stammer out another defense, but Harrison simply raised his hand, cutting her off instantly. He gestured to Veronica, his lead corporate litigator, who was sitting quietly at the edge of the mahogany table. Veronica stood up and placed a thick leather-bound binder directly in front of Naomi. The gold lettering on the cover read "Prenuptial Agreement." Harrison began to clinically dissect Naomi's financial execution. He reminded her of the specific penalty clauses she had willingly signed 2 years ago. He explained that a standard infidelity clause would have simply limited her alimony. However, she had not just committed infidelity. She had actively conspired to commit federal wire fraud and money laundering while using his private equity firm as a financial vehicle. By intentionally mixing stolen capital with his corporate assets, she had triggered the absolute maximum penalty clause written into the contract. Veronica opened the binder and pointed to a heavily highlighted paragraph. She read the legal terms aloud, her voice devoid of pity. Because Naomi had engaged in documented criminal conspiracy against her spouse's financial interests, the prenuptial agreement instantly reverted to a total asset forfeiture. Naomi was legally entitled to zero alimony. She surrendered all rights to the marital properties, the investment portfolios, and the joint bank accounts. Naomi stared at the contract, her jaw dropping open as the catastrophic reality set in. She tried to argue that a judge would never uphold such a draconian penalty. Veronica smiled a razor-sharp smile and informed her that Harrison's legal team had already submitted the activated contract to the presiding family court judge early this morning. The forfeiture was legally binding. Harrison then moved on to the immediate consequences. He instructed Naomi to place her keys on the table. The luxury white SUV she drove through the gates belonged to his corporate fleet. She was no longer authorized to drive it. He then pointed to the expensive crocodile skin handbag she was clutching. He calmly noted that it was purchased using a credit card tied to his primary checking account. He demanded she empty her personal items onto the table and leave the bag behind. Naomi began to hyperventilate again, realizing she was being systematically stripped of every single ounce of wealth she had acquired. She cried out, asking how she was supposed to survive if he took absolutely everything from her. I finally stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Harrison. I looked at the woman who had laughed at the thought of me losing my house. I told her she could take a walk in the rain just like I did. I reminded her she was leaving this estate with the exact same amount of money she had left me with. Zero. My brother-in-law stepped out of the shadows and handed her a federal subpoena. She had absolutely no other choice but to accept the plea deal. She signed the documents immediately. She knew that any resistance would only guarantee her immediate imprisonment. Her luxurious life was officially over forever. The court proceedings concluded with a speed and efficiency that sent shockwaves through the local legal community. Because DeAndre and Veronica had assembled an absolute mountain of undeniable forensic evidence. There was no drawn-out trial. Greg's defense attorney took one look at the digital IP logs, the matching timestamps, and the offshore routing numbers, and immediately advised his client to surrender. The federal judge presiding over the case was absolutely disgusted by the blatant, highly premeditated nature of the fraud. During the civil settlement phase, the judge invoked a specific federal statute designed to punish malicious financial crimes. I was awarded treble damages. That meant the court ordered Greg to pay me triple the amount of the original stolen funds. I immediately recouped my stolen $150,000 multiplied by 3, resulting in $450,000 of pure financial restitution deposited straight into my name. Furthermore, the judge recognized that I had zero involvement in the fraudulent loan application. The $200,000 home equity line of credit was completely voided against my property and pinned entirely onto Greg's personal financial ledger. My house was completely safe, and the deed was completely clear. But the financial retribution did not stop there. Because the restaurant was funded by my stolen capital, the court awarded me full ownership of the liquidated assets. Harrison's legal team systematically dismantled the entire commercial space. They sold the imported Italian marble, auctioned off the commercial kitchen equipment, and liquidated the premium liquor inventory. Every single dollar from that liquidation sale went directly into my newly secured bank accounts. Greg's sentencing hearing was incredibly brief. He stood before the federal judge wearing a standard-issue prison jumpsuit, completely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his towering narcissistic ego. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering, without any possibility of early parole. Greg cried as the marshals led him away in heavy steel handcuffs, but his tears were purely for himself. He had gambled his entire life for a taste of unearned luxury, and he had lost everything. Naomi managed to avoid federal prison, but her freedom came at an incredibly high and painful price. She was forced to cooperate fully with the Internal Revenue Service and testify against Greg to secure a plea deal. Because the prenuptial agreement was fully activated, she walked away from her marriage to Harrison with zero alimony, zero property, and zero assets. Burdened with astronomical legal fees from her criminal defense attorneys, she was thrust into absolute poverty overnight. The elite high society circles of Seattle completely shunned her. The wealthy socialites who used to drink expensive champagne with her at high-end charity galas suddenly pretended she did not even exist. I later learned through local industry connections that Naomi was currently working a grueling minimum wage job at a budget retail store. She spent her days folding cheap clothes, dedicating her entire meager paycheck to slowly chipping away at her massive mountain of legal debt. She was entirely destitute and completely terrified of the harsh reality she had created for herself. I refused to simply sit on my newly acquired wealth and play the role of a quiet, recovering victim. I took the massive financial settlement, the liquidated restaurant capital, and my highly trained analytical skills, and I built an absolute empire of my own. I launched an elite data analytics consulting firm, catering specifically to high-level corporate clients and international financial institutions. My very first official executive hire was the brilliant man who helped me trace the digital breadcrumbs of my ex-husband's betrayal. I brought DeAndre on board as my chief financial officer. Together we built a formidable powerhouse agency that rapidly gained immense respect throughout the highly competitive Seattle financial sector. I was no longer a quiet, predictable remote employee working long hours in sweatpants to fund a liar's lavish lifestyle. I was a powerful chief executive officer, calling my own shots, setting my own rates, and securing massive corporate contracts on my own terms. The most profound transformation, however, happened outside of the courtroom and the boardroom. It happened on a crisp autumn evening as I stood on the expansive stone balcony of Harrison's estate. I held a glass of red wine looking out over the dark, peaceful waters of Lake Washington. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and deep purple. The fiercely tactical alliance we had formed in that dingy, neon-lit diner had slowly and beautifully evolved into something deeply profound and entirely genuine. Harrison stepped out onto the balcony and stood right beside me. The cold, detached billionaire who had approached me in the freezing rain so many months ago was completely gone. In his place stood a fiercely protective, incredibly honorable partner who deeply respected my intellect and cherished my unyielding strength. The trauma of our respective betrayals had bound us together, but our mutual admiration and undeniable chemistry had forged a real, lasting love. He reached out and took my hand, warmly intertwining his strong fingers with mine. He looked directly into my eyes, his slate gaze filled with absolute devotion. He told me that our tactical paper marriage had successfully destroyed our enemies, but he wanted to build something completely new and entirely ours. He asked me for a real wedding. He asked me to be his wife not as a calculated legal strategy, but as a genuine lifelong equal partner. I smiled, feeling a deep radiating warmth spread through my chest, and I confidently said yes. When someone steals your foundation, they don't realize they've just given you the space to build an empire. Have you ever turned a devastating betrayal into your greatest victory? Tell me your story in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and never let anyone tell you that your value is tied to their loyalty.